cell phones in silent mode or vibrate mode. On behalf of UIC United, the UIC chapter of the State Universities Annuitants Association, SUAA, and APAC, the UIC Academic Professional Advisory Committee, I welcome you to our annual Fall Forum on Politics in Illinois. As the state's third largest SUAA chapter with over 1,600 members, we share the organization's commitment to participation in civic activities that further the enlightenment and welfare of our members, who include actively employed as well as retired members of the state university's retirement system and their survivors. During the past several years, our chapter has sponsored these panel discussions whose themes have been drawn from timely political events playing out in the state of Illinois. In 2008, we hosted a debate on whether the state should hold a constitutional convention. And last year, a panel discussion on political corruption in Illinois, which, as recent events have shown, has been a chronic issue in the state. In previous years, we held forums dealing with the pension funding crisis in Illinois, and this issue will be the focus of attention in today's discussion. In this regard, I would like to acknowledge the role that our board member Dick Johnson has played in organizing today's program, as well as those in past years. Dick, who is the past president of our parent organization, cannot be with us today. He is in Portugal. I'd also like to acknowledge the presence of the UIC Chancellor, Paula Allen Mears, the Chancellor has graciously come to be here with us during this forum. Unfortunately, she will have to leave early, but we thank her for coming. Our program is being broadcast live on the internet via the Ustream.tv website, thanks to UIC United member Jim Lindbergh, who is over there at the PC. The video will be archived for viewing at that site afterwards. Details for accessing it are posted on the UIC United website, or feel free to contact me. I'm pleased to introduce our moderator, UIC Emeritus Professor Irving Miller, a past president of our chapter, who will introduce our four panelists and explain the format for this program. In closing, I thank you for coming and hope that you find this event thought-provoking and useful. Irv.
Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to our panel, which the title is Public Policy, Politics, and Pensions, Addressing Illinois' Desperate Fiscal Situation, a panel discussion. I think this is very timely, and I think the size of this audience demonstrates that. Before I introduce the speakers, let me just a few ground rules. Sorry. Is it on? Okay, sorry. A few ground rules. Since we have about an hour and a half thereabouts for this discussion, what we will have is basically two rounds of presentations. The first round will be about 10 minutes. Second round, 5. The second round is not, I mean, you could call it a rebuttal, but it really isn't. What it really is our thought is that if the first round provokes some thoughts among the speakers, we'll have a chance to express them in the second round. We will then have a Q&A, and for the Q&A, we have cards and pencils. We would prefer that you put your questions on the cards with the name of who you address the question to, and I will read the questions. The cards are over there, and there are pencils available as well. If we run out of cards, we have some time left, we'll take questions from the floor. With that, let's get started. I'd like to introduce the panel to you in alphabetical order, and from my near left, the first panelist is Eden Martin, who who is counsel to the law firm of Sidley Austin, and is president of the Commercial Club of Chicago, and the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club. You probably have seen some of his writings in the Tribune, and perhaps have seen him on television as well. He is a member of several boards, including the Chicago Board of Options Exchange, Aon Corporation, and so forth. He's a graduate of UIC, so we call him home. He will be our first speaker. The second speaker will be Ralph Martire, who is the executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. He's also a regular columnist in local papers, in the Sun Times, in the State Journal Register, the Herald News. He has served on advisory boards to our former governor, and has been the principal author of a study that the center produced that identified revenue enhancement proposals to address the two fiscal crisis. It seems to have fiscal crisis every year. So, and Ralph will be second. Our third speaker is John McCarron, who you may also have seen on television, and who is he calls himself a scribe, and he is a contributing op-ed columnist for the Tribune, has appeared on Chicago Tonight and other places, and he has been vice president of planning and communications for the Metropolitan Planning Council, and has been a freelance writer since then. And he writes a number of op-ed pieces, and he has commented on this subject in the past. And our fourth and final speaker is Addison Woodward, who is emeritus professor at Government State University, and is a current member of the Board of Higher Education. Has been actively involved with SUAA over the years. He is president of SUAA Action, which is the lobbying group that we have established for supporting the retirement systems. And without further ado, I will welcome Mr. Martin to the podium.
Very much for coming today. This program is billed as having to do with politics, among other things. So I want to say at the outset that ours is not a political group. Commercial club has been around for about 140 years. The Civic Committee is a group within that, made up of executives from main businesses in the Northern Illinois region, law firms, consulting firms, accounting firms, presidents of the University of Illinois. There's a member of the Commercial Club, although she may not want that to hear what I've got to say. But we're not partisan. We don't support particular candidates or oppose them or particular parties. We're trying to do this on the basis of issues and public education. Second thing, word of introduction that maybe isn't necessary. I do bring bad news, but I don't bring it with bad will. Hope that will become apparent as we go through here. Particularly at the University of Illinois, I'm a graduate of 1962. My mother graduated from here about 10 years before that. My only brother and all four of my kids went to the U of I. So, and I'm on the U of I Foundation Board, so I've been close to the U of I all of my adult life and still feel very close to it. But we all have a problem in Illinois, and it's a shared problem. I'm going to go quickly through a few slides that maybe I will. To lay out some of the facts. If you want to dig deeper, you can go to a website called IllinoisBroke.com. There's two ways of getting at how the state's doing. One is to look at how are we doing annually, like an annual operating statement. Within a period of time, how did
frame out an operating statement for the current fiscal year, which is not a calendar year. It runs from July 1 to the end of June. So we're currently in the fiscal 2011 year. And we ask ourselves, if you look at our recurring revenues and our recurring expenditures, not one-time stuff, what's the balance? We have a whole, how big is the whole? The other thing we do is we don't limit ourselves to cash. State government works on a cash basis. Government, business does not. Business asks not just about cash, but about growing obligations, which you're going to have to pay someday, even if it's not this year. That's called accrual accounting. So what we were trying to get at is, if you look at the recurring revenues and recurring expenses and costs, which we are incurring actually this year and will have to pay someday, how does that balance out? And if you limit yourself to cash, this year it's probably in the $7 to $8 billion range. And if you add the costs which we don't recognize but are there and will have to be paid someday, largely in the retirement area, it's another $7 billion. So what we believe is accurate, and nobody has challenged these numbers. There are, by the way, different ways of looking at the reality. But if you look at it the way we do, to try to get an embedded annual budget deficit that includes not just cash, but costs that we are incurring, it's in the range of $14 to $15 billion. And the $7 billion is underfunded retirement costs. That's at the state level. It doesn't include the municipalities, doesn't include the local fire department. It's at the state level, 5 pension plans, including yours, certainly. And basically what this says is that in addition to the costs that the state acknowledges in its funding formula, if you go to actuaries and you say, what's the real cost that we're incurring this year as a state through those 5 pension plans, they will tell you, they disagree a little bit about the details, but not much, that it's another $7 billion. And if we were funding these things right, the way the private sector has to do it under federal tax law, you would have to fund it at an extra $7 billion. So the funding formula we have, including the one for your plan, over time has radically underfunded the amount of the cost that's being incurred each year. So this is the one-year view. Now, what does that mean on a sort of balance sheet concept? This is not for a period, it's up until right now. And what it says is that over here to the left, the state's got some debt, general obligation debt, about $15 billion of debt that we owe, mostly in the form of bonds. You've got some other debt that we have incurred because we don't pay our bills. So we owe money to, let's say, the University of Illinois, or the hospitals, or social service agencies, or people that sell stuff to the state, and the state doesn't pay its bills on time. Another $15 billion. Over to the right, in the red, are the retirement-related liabilities. The unfunded pension liability is reported by the state using its numbers to be order of magnitude, about $80 billion estimated at the end of the current fiscal year. Unfunded retiree health care liability, which is either the liability or the policy. Ralph and I were talking about this earlier. It may not be a legal liability, but it's a practice by the state to pay retirees health care from the time they retire until they hit Medicare, and then to pay the Medicare supplement. And to the extent that that's treated as an ongoing liability, it's about $40 billion present value. And then you've got some more pension bonds, which is basically money that we borrowed to dump into the pension funds, but it's retirement related. A lot of facts, a lot of data. The one takeaway from this slide is that the liabilities that we have at the state, while large, are manageable except for the retirement related obligations of the pension funds in the form of the liabilities, the health care, and the pension which are liabilities of the state. That's the largest part of this, basically $130 billion out of 160. But one other piece of bad news, that $79 to $80 billion number, if you can see it, which is the estimated liability of the 5 pension funds. This is the difference between the liability and the assets. So if you take $130 billion roughly of liability, $50 billion of assets roughly, go to the market and see what the stocks are worth. The difference is order of magnitude about $80 billion if you calculate it the way the state does. I'm not going to take you into discount rates, but if you're interested in this stuff, the only way you get these numbers is by using discount rates to bring back future liabilities to today's values. Because you can't add up a dollar that you owe in 2013 and a dollar that you owe in 2022. It's apples and oranges and terms. You've got to do it with current numbers, and the only way to do that, according to actuaries and accountants or investment bankers, is to present value the liability. If you do it right, according to Josh Rao at Northwestern and a fellow named Novi Marx, who's at the Business School of Chicago, it isn't $79 billion, it's $200 billion. $200 billion is the present liability. By the way, another piece of good news is this doesn't include the municipality. This is just the 5 state pension plans. So, the point is, we got a terrible problem. The state's budget deficit is going to crowd out. It's already starting to do lots of things that we all hold very important, like university education, K-12 education, healthcare, social service agencies, lots of other things. And it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. It's an enormous problem, and at the core of it is the retirement systems. That's what these numbers tell you. I know I'm limited on my time. I do want to show you briefly that this is a problem that did not happen in 2008. It's a problem that's been growing since 1998, and if you went back to the 1980s, it was there too. Why are we growing this unfunded liability each year? It's because we never developed a formula based on actuarial standards, and it was known from the beginning. People in both parties knew. They didn't think they could afford to fund at the actuarially required level, and nobody made them, so they passed a formula and didn't. And then they've taken holidays since then, which has further aggravated the problem. This problem did not happen in 2008. It's been building for 25 years.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. By the way, Mr. Martin brought us a few brochures on his stuff, which are here at the top if you want to afterwards. Again, let me remind you that if you have questions for any of the speakers, we will have cards. Next is Ralph Martire.
I'll need some technical help there, so while you're getting that set up, I'll talk without a microphone for just a second. I run the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. We are a bipartisan group, which mostly means my board of directors really doesn't get along with each other. But that's a good thing in that it forces us to be data-based. We do not take an ideological approach to stuff. We look at numbers, and we try to bring math into the equation. So I will try to bring a little math into this and explain where Illinois is today so you can all understand it. Look at all these numbers. Ain't that great? Have you heard the state has a $13 billion deficit this year? You've all heard that. That's been repeated. The governor says it. Here's how you get it. Look at that top little series of numbers. We have $6 billion in bills we owe for services provided in the year 2010 that we haven't paid yet. We're now in fiscal year 11. It has to be paid this year by law. Second, we got to pay $4.6 billion in debt that we owe to banks and bond houses, et cetera, for debt issuance. Has to be paid by law this year. Third, the General Assembly initially appropriated $26 billion to spend on public services this year in the general fund. And by public services, I mean 4 things. The general fund, 9 out of $10 goes to education, healthcare, human services, and public safety. Now, I want you to remember that because when politicians, and although we are a 501c3 nonprofit and we don't take political stances or reverse, we recognize the role of politics. When politicians tell you they're going to solve problems with across-the-board cuts, I just identified the board. It is education, it is healthcare, it is human services, it is public safety. And that's why those who advocate cuts frequently don't detail where those cuts would come from, because they don't want you all to know. Across the board sounds a lot better. All right, $26 billion appropriated to those services, and then our pension payment this year that we have to pay by the end of the year is $3.5 billion. That means we need $40 billion in revenue. What do we got in revenue? $21 billion coming from state sources, 5 and change coming from the feds, $27 billion. $40 billion in needs, $27 billion in revenue, $13 billion hole. That's how you get there. Pretty simple, pretty easy math. All right. Now, even the math-challenged individuals in the General Assembly recognize that a 50% hole in your general fund budget is probably not a good place to be. So they asked the governor to make some cuts, which he did. So in July, he announced them. In August, he detailed them, $1.4 billion in cuts. So that reduces the appropriated amount for this year for the general fund from $26 billion down to $24.9, still leaving an $11 billion hole. You follow me on this chart? All right. Then they said, let's get some one-time revenue to pay for some of this stuff this year. Of course, it's money we won't have next year, so whatever goes into our operating budget this year, good luck next year. But they did that. First thing they did was sell off the tobacco litigation proceeds. This is an ongoing revenue stream the state gets, about $350 million a year, based on, that lawsuit all the states had against the tobacco companies for somewhat misleading marketing materials about the health risks associated with their products. We are now giving up that revenue stream. That's going away for a one-time payment of $1.2 billion. So not only will we have to replace the $1.2 billion that we securitized it for this year, we got to replace that ongoing revenue stream. Nice piece of work. We're going to get $250 million from the tax amnesty program. We're going to get $1 billion from rating special funds, and I want to talk about special funds for a second. Special funds, things like affordable housing, clean air, clean water, special interest, that stuff. Rated that for $1 billion. So we found $2.5 billion roughly in one-time revenue, leaving a hole of $9 billion in a $24 billion budget, 37%. Across the board cuts mean education, healthcare, human services, and public safety have to be cut by that $9 billion, because that's 9 out of $10 we spent. That's 37% of the projected expenditures this year. Now, that might be a reasonable thing to do if we were a profligate, wasteful spending state, right? We're not. Okay. Back in fiscal year 2000, our general fund budget was $21 billion. $1.2 billion was our pension payment. We spent $20 billion on those 4 core services that year. If that expenditure just kept up with inflation and population growth, the next column, in 2010, we'd have to be spending $26 billion to buy the same amount of services we bought for $20 billion a decade ago. It wasn't. In 2010, the budget was $24.9. That's a $1.3 billion less in real inflation and population adjusted terms. And I just understated how much we backed off in spending over this period of time. Why? I'll tell you why. I used as my inflation metric there the consumer price index, the CPI. Great inflation metric for the economy as a whole. Not so much for public services, and here's why. The consumer price index includes things like Pop-Tarts, Clorox bleach, Martire, cheap by the way, Macy's had a sale, $11 a tie for a bunch. All right. If you use the more accurate inflation metric of the employment cost index, the ECI, to buy $20 billion worth of labor, and let's face it, all public services are highly labor intensive, 85 to 90% of every budget, we'd actually have to have a general fund of $30 billion in the year 2010 to buy the same amount of labor that $20 billion purchased back in the year 2000. We weren't, we were spending 24.9, that's a $5 billion cut in real terms. So I don't care which way you want to look at it. In real inflation-adjusted terms, we are spending anywhere from 1.3 to 5 billion less on those 4 core services than we did a decade ago. That's the reality in Illinois, which, by the way, in case you didn't know, is the 5th largest economy of any state in this nation. And if we were an independent country, we'd have the 27th largest economy in the world. We have a larger economy than Saudi Arabia, Ireland, Greece, Norway, Colombia. You may have heard of a couple of those places. All right. This is the historic breakdown of how the state spends its money. You can see the top part of the general fund budget goes to education. That's everything from pre-K on up through higher ed, community colleges and universities. The next biggest chunk is healthcare, 30% of the budget. Human services, historically 21%, and I'm tired of that phrase. Human services is a meaningless, generic term that we ought to throw away. Do you want to know what human services really are? Over half of human services, 54%, are 2 things: mental health and developmental disability. You get up to 3/4 of human services when you add in the Department on Aging, taking care of homebound seniors, abused and neglected seniors, that kind of stuff. The final 25% of human services, that's stuff like child care for single working parents, caring for abused and neglected children, substance abuse, that fleshy government stuff. Bottom line is public safety, 5% of the budget.
So net, historically, our general fund, 9 out of $10 goes to those four things. That is the board for across-the-board cuts. No way around it. No way. 2 minutes. All right. So I'll skip that. And I'll probably skip that. And I'll even skip that. Medicaid. I've heard that we should scale back Medicaid expenditures to save money because it's crowding everything out. That would be ridiculously poor public policy. Look, this is the biggest increase in Medicaid spending over any period of time in our history, from 03 to 09. See, the ramp up is almost $5 billion in total expenses. But the problem is, it's not state money. This is state tax dollars, the smaller blue bar. What we've really done is use the gain, that little greenish sick color, to leverage a bunch of federal dollars. That green bar in the middle is intergovernment transfers between the state of Illinois and Cook County. Here's how that works. Cook County gives us, let's say, $900 million, and we give them a check right back, $900 million. We say, go spend that on Medicaid. And the second we do that, the federal government says that counts as a state expenditure for Medicaid, we'll give you match. Okay? We're gaming the system. The hospital assessment tax is in there. Once again, charge a tax to hospitals, we collect it, pay it back to hospitals for Medicaid. Federal government says that qualifies for match. So for hardly any increase in tax dollars, we are leveraging billions from the feds to underwrite our healthcare industry. That would be good fiscal policy. There's that pension ramp that Eden put up there, and as you can see, it's creepy. By the way, it was based on an unfunded liability of $40 billion. And it's at least $80 billion today. So whatever that ramp is, it's not adequate to pay the current unfunded liability. We agree with that. So how did we get that ramp? Well, back in 1995, politicians told us they were going to be responsible with our then unfunded liability of around $7 to $10 billion. And they were going to create a 45-year payment schedule for it. What they did was intentionally and by law, from 1995 to 2010, underfunded their normal cost for 15 years, backloaded the whole thing. They created this problem by law. All right, that's what they did. That's not responsible. And I agree the 80 billion figure is probably a little shy, because I also have some concerns about the discount rate. So we could agree on that. But what's interesting about this whole thing, when they play shenanigans with your pensions, they really do it big time. They claimed that based on some pension reforms that were passed, they were going to save money this year. So instead of making the $4.2 billion required by this ramp in payments this year, they reduced it to 3.5. Without accounting for the increase in the unfunded liability from where the law thought it would be at $40 billion to the $80 billion it was after the markets crashed, creating a bigger unfunding down the road in the future. I will add, we are low tax overall, we're low spending overall. There's not one analyst that has looked at this that says our problems could be solved without a major tax increase. And if we were to do that and do it the right way, we'd go up from one of the lowest taxing states in the nation to one of the lowest taxing states in the nation. I mean, we really wouldn't lose that status, but we would be able to pay our obligations. Thank you.
Again, a reminder about questions. The cards will be passed out. Just raise your hand and you'll get a card. Next, we have John McCarron.
These are on, right?
They are on, so you're free.
I didn't do PowerPoint, so I'm going to take advantage of that and sit here also because I'm using the poor man's teleprompter here, and that way my aging eyes are closer to the source of my remarks. Like a lot of journalists, one reason I chose my profession was that I wouldn't have to do the math. I flunked long division in 4th grade. I couldn't memorize my multiplication table, still haven't. Still have a lot of trouble with sevens, 7 times 6, 7 times 8. It just doesn't come to my mind as maybe it does yours. So imagine my surprise when, during the mid-70s, when I started on the urban affairs beat at the Tribune, my city editor came up to me and said that my beat from henceforward would have to include property tax. So I got a good pocket calculator and dove in and quickly discovered that the best thing about covering property taxes, or any kind of taxes for that matter, is that the stories usually wound up on the front page. They're pocketbook stories. Everybody's interested. Everyone has to pay. But it was a different era back then. We had more public policy discussions on the news pages, and fewer front page stories about, say, Oprah Winfrey, who was on the cover of yesterday's Chicago Sun-Times. Oprah was leaving us. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Maybe we can talk about how our journalism is covering these kind of issues later. One year, though, back then, I got into a Can You Top This competition with Lynn Sweet of the Chicago Sun-Times, now their Washington Bureau chief. And together we made the Cook County property tax multiplier a central issue in the gubernatorial race between Jim Thompson and Adlai Stevenson, just by doing, he said sort of stories about the equalization fact. I mean, that was a different time. There was more news then, I think, about this sort of issue. But even then, one couldn't write about state or municipal finance without writing about the, what I guess you could call the then nascent problem of underfunding pensions. In fact, I dug up a story that I did for the Trib's Metro section back in the June of 1977. I think that's about 35 years. That's one of those 7 things. So I'm not sure how long ago. I think it's about almost 35 years ago. I didn't bring the calculator. But here's the story. And the headline is Pension Fund Bomb Threatens Area Suburbs. And I go on to explain how the new state law passed in 1975 that provided pensioners with automatic annual 3% cost of living increases, coupled with other sweeteners that the legislature was providing, was causing rapid increases in the unfunded liability of suburban police and fire pension funds. I think it had knocked, in 3 years' time, it had knocked the rate of funding from 39% down to 36%. And I'm quoting someone, the village manager of Herm Spar from Park Ridge, said that blame for inadequate legal pension, local pension funds lies mainly with the state legislature. The unions pressure the legislature for better pensions, Spar said. They are supposed to study the cost, but typically it's not done. So someone used to figure the last 25 years, actually we'll go 35 years or more when this ball started rolling downhill. So now here we are in 2010. The ball has rolled as far downhill apparently as it can go. And not just in Illinois. Remember, for all the horribles we just had described to you, California's unfunded liability is 7 times ours, roughly. There's that number 7 again. Or about $550 billion in unfunded pension liability out there in the Golden State. So it's true across much of America now that pension fund portfolios have been ravaged and tax revenues reduced by the worst economic recession of our lifetimes. Now, I won't even try to match the description of our pension problem or the merits of the proposed solutions offered by my fellow panelists, who you can see know more about this than I'm ever going to. I was, however, taken by a couple of paragraphs written not too long ago in the February issue of Illinois Issues magazine by a friend of mine, Charlie Wheeler, who used to run the Sun-Times Bureau in Springfield and now teaches at the U of I Springfield, where I believe he is a pension hopeful. In fact, that was identified in the article. But Charlie said, and I put a lot of store in Charlie, he said in the Illinois Issues articles, the commitments Illinois has made to provide retirement security for more than 700,000 downstate teachers, state workers, and university employees pose the greatest financial challenge the state has ever faced. Financial experts warn that the continued unchecked growth of pension debt threatens to reach a tipping point beyond which the state won't be able to reverse a fiscal slide into bankruptcy. So scary stuff, but finally, I noticed in my invitation to this event that it was to be a forum on public policy, politics, and pensions. So since maybe I'm the one with the least to lose up here, let me veer into the political. What are the political implications of this crisis that we face? The most serious implication, I think, is not the give and take that is going to occur pretty soon between Governor Quinn, Speaker Madigan, and Senate President Cullen. It's not whether this issue will strengthen the hand of Senator Bill Brady in his upcoming race with Governor Pat Quinn, although parenthetically it will strengthen his hand, I believe. Or even which of the 20 or 30 candidates we may soon see run for mayor of Chicago will be heard or helped by the city's $700 million budgetary gap. Although I suspect it's in the short term it may work in favor of someone like Ed Burke getting drafted by the business community. Perhaps he even already has a call into Ed Burke, I don't know, but I would look for someone of a sort of a conservative continuing bent to be summoned forward among the hopefuls. No, I think the biggest political implication of the pension crisis is national in scope, and it will be to greatly strengthen the anti-spending, anti-deficit, anti-government, pro-libertarian Tea Party kind of movement, and all that movement's allies, works, pomps, and candidates. Politicians on the right will be asking middle-class Americans who typically don't have defined benefit pensions, who typically, not typically, but who increasingly have no pensions at all, many workers working as temps, part-timers and whatnot, asking them why they should pay higher taxes to quote-unquote bureaucrats who retire at age 60, who collect 80% of their final pay, plus health insurance, plus a 3% guaranteed COLA every year. And of course, the less you know about this issue, the more reasonable that argument sounds. American politics then for the foreseeable future is going to be about who can harness the anger growing up among a majority of Americans who are earning less, who own less, home values for instance, and worst of all, who are coming to grips with what appears to be a future of less for their children. It's going to be a huge blame game that we're going to see in national and local politics over the next few years. And public anger over tax increases to pay for other people's pension benefits much better than their benefits, will be a big part of that blame game. Perhaps we should spend some of our time here this afternoon discussing what folks should really be angry about, but I'll leave that decision to our moderator, and I thank you for these remarks.
Thank you. Thank you, and I guess we have more slides from Addison Woodward. Which are circulating.
the status bar it might have been. And I need to get my copy, so I'm going to grab it. That presents some CSRS data, and that looks at 5 years, 1982 to 1986. It looks at the actuarial shortfall of just those 5 years, an average of about $176 million a year. If that money had been invested and received the rate of return that CSRS had actually achieved for through 2004, that would have been $6.9 billion more into CSRS pensions. So the status quo is the house in that. The third table presents data, number of current employees in each of the 5 systems, the number of annuitants, and the total. The Chicago Tribune and the Civic Federation have used what I call statistically rare instances to make sweeping generalizations about our pension system. So if you take, the 100 highest CSRS pensions, that's all of 0.2%. Yet we are hearing that our pensions are gold-plated Cadillac based upon what I call outlier data. If you take the highest 500 state pensions across the 3 largest pension systems, we're accepting the General Assembly retirement system and the judicial retirement system. You take the 500 highest pensions, that's all of 0.3%. So you want to consider those numbers. Also, take a look at a couple of comments I make about the General Assembly retirement system. The next table, 2005 pension modifications. I'm going to slide over those. You can read them. But there were significant pension modifications done in 2005. There was a cap on maximum salary increase last year, 6%. They did away with the money purchase formula. There was language dealing with the early retirement option, and there was they eliminated lump sum payments for sick leave in the last year's retirement to reduce the retirement payout. The slide after that was a comparison of all 5 pension systems after the 2005 pension modifications. You can look at that. That's useful data. But the generalizations I would make from that table: the top pensions for judges and lawmakers is 85% of the last highest salary after 20 years. Top pensions for CSRS, TRS, and CRS is 75% after 35 years. The pension is determined by average of highest 4 years for CSRS, TRS, and CRS. The lawmakers and judges, it's the last day of work, so if you get bumped into a higher paying job, that determines the pension, not an average of the last 4 years. And of course, the end of the money purchase formula means that CSRS employees are going to be working 35 years to get a 75% pension. What? Oh, we're on. Oh, good. We're moving right along. Okay. That's right. I think I'll look at that. I'm sorry. Well, I'm just trying to get the number on it. Oh, that's right. Yeah. The next slide are some comments about the recent Pension Act that was passed, Pension Act 960889, it's actually a public act. There's some pretty bad provisions there. There's an excessive early retirement penalty. The COLA has been changed to 3% and 1/2 of the CPI, whichever is less. The new COLA does not compound. There's a cap, artificially low cap in top pensions, and an 8-year final average that is used to determine the pension base. This table shows you the effects of a 6% early retirement penalty on retirees as a function of years worked. If you look at all the brown bars, that's what employees now would receive after 20 years, 25 years, 30 or 35 years. The lower bar in each grouping reflects the penalty. So a person who works 20 years, I got the numbers here, so the person who works 20 years and retires at 62 is hit with a 30% penalty, which is $6,600. And I'll skip to the last person. The person who works 35 years and retires at 62 gets hit with an $11,500 penalty. I'm calling it a penalty because that's relative to what employees would receive today. This just reiterates a couple of things. The average CSUA employee retires at 62 after 20 years of work with a pension of $31,300. The prior graph represented an employee whose final average salary was $50,000. And then it tells you what our retirement multiplier is. Now there is economic benefit of Illinois to the Illinois economy of pension dollars. There are about 150,000 current pension recipients that live in Illinois, and the state pays out somewhat over $4 billion. There is a benefit or a multiplier of $1.50 for each pension dollar. So that $4 billion that's paid out generates about $6 billion in the Illinois economy. That's data from TRS. So, 1 minute. Okay, we're moving quickly. There's a table of unintended consequences that people have not really considered of the Public Act 980889. That's not exhaustive. You will probably be able to add some. This slide's a copy of a letter from the mayor of Aurora. His proxy was used at the last meeting, although he gave it to no one. And as a result, the Pension Modification Task Force group, which met all summer, could not recommend their own report because the mayor's proxy was usurped. There's a little bit further analysis of that and some other comments. And my summary and conclusions are that for nearly 2 decades, lawmakers have willfully underfunded Illinois pensions. They have ignored the need for increased revenue with one exception and used funds through the pension system to pay current expenses. Paul Krugman of the New York Times would call this starving the beast. Illinois pensions have been reformed twice. Each time, that became an excuse to use savings yet to be realized to offset current payments. Pension Public Act 960889 is seriously flawed, and unintended consequences need to be addressed. Our lawmakers need to address the larger issue now, and that's the need for increased revenue. So, in answer to the question, what is the best descriptor of our pension systems? Is it a gold-plated Cadillac or a Cadillac clunker? I would say it's neither. We've been driving around in a Ford or Chevy, but new hires, those hired in 2011, they get the Cadillac clunker.
Thank you, Addison. You can now, I will now ask for additional comments from the speakers and from Mr. Martin.
Clear away a couple of dead cats. The Civic Federation has been referred to in here in their presentations and so forth. That's a different organization. I'm the Civic Committee. They can take care of themselves, but I represent the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club. California, a lot worse than we are. Also a lot bigger than we are. If you real embedded deficit. And I believe when you do that, which is what businesses try to do, it's more than the 13 billion, which includes a bunch of piled payables from the last several years. It's in the range of 14 to 15 billion dollars. This $27 billion number for revenues is roughly right. It's a huge problem. Now, so we agree, most of us, on the nature of the problem, although we say it differently. We use different numbers to explain it, but we all agree there's a big problem. What do you do about it? That's the problem. Everybody agrees, mostly, that if you raise the income tax rate on individuals, this is a big way we get tax revenues in the state, a 1 percentage point increase will produce roughly $3 billion a year to spend. Our current tax rate is 3%. The governor has proposed, what, 1%? 1%. 1%.
But some of it has to go to property tax.
Yeah, that's right. Others have said no taxes are necessary. But 1% is $3 billion, and what we're saying, and I believe we're right, is that the embedded hole is close to 14 to 15 billion. And I don't believe anybody in any party running for any office has been candid with the public about the enormity of this problem or how much of a tax increase it's going to take to solve it if all we do is raise taxes. Because that, there's two ways to fill a hole. One is to cut costs, the other is to raise taxes or some combination. If we do it entirely on the revenue side, and if we were to do it through income tax rates on individuals, it's closer to a 5 percentage point increase from 3 to 8. And that is not trivial in terms of what it does to the economy of the state. Now, I'm not going to tell you that that's the only tax that people are talking about. They're also talking about raising the rates on retirees. Today, if you're retired, you don't pay an Illinois income tax rate on that. We're one of the few states that doesn't. So if you're retired and you get hit with an income tax rate, you're going to feel it even more than people who aren't retired. Let me just take one more minute and deal with the basic reform here, because we are advocating both reform and adequate funding. Our friends in organized labor are saying basically it's a funding problem. You can just fund it adequately, have to be enough, raise the taxes, whatever it takes. Don't worry me about reform. Here's why we're advocating reform as well as increased funding. Bear with me, because I have found this. If you're in the private sector, and many of you have spent years there, as I've spent most of my life, you will know that the private sector used to have pension plans like defined benefit plans, okay, like what you experienced. Over the last 20 years or so, even starting before that, in many cases, they have shifted to defined contribution plans, which are quite different. Or they have reformed the defined benefit plans, or they've gone to cash balance plans, or plans that combine the features of both defined contribution and pension. Very rare do you find defined benefit plans still there for new employees, and almost unheard of to have one that permits people to retire with a full pension if they have enough years of service at the age of 55. I don't know about teachers. If you work for the state of Illinois, you can retire at 55 if you've got enough years and you get a full pension, and then you can do something else. And if you work for the city of Chicago, you've got enough years, you can retire at 50. And that's what makes these things expensive, because then the pensions have to apply over a much longer period than the normal case where somebody retires from the private sector at, say, 65. In addition, state employees get essentially 100% of their retiree health premium paid for from the time whenever, 55, 56, till they get to Medicare. So those are very expensive. They simply don't exist in the private sector, and that's where most of the taxpayers live. And so I know this is not what you want to hear, but what we are advocating is a combination of reforms and after that, we're going to have to look at taxes, because we can't cover all of this, I think. But what we are saying is don't go to the revenue side first. Go to the reform side first. There are ways to cut money out of this budget. Government is not that efficient, either at the state level or the city level. And once good faith, serious efforts are made on the reform side and the cost side, then let's turn and look at the revenue side. One final thought. What happens if we don't do this? What happens if we continue to muddle along the way we have is that the state is not the guarantor of these pension fund obligations. It would be a disaster if the pension fund runs out of money because, to say the least, it is not clear what will happen. And to look at the law literally, it is probable that the state is not the guarantor, and even if it were, it doesn't have the money. So we have to deal with this, and we have to deal with it now, because if we just let it drift and go on for the next 9 or 10 years, I think we're going to face a problem that nobody can really understand the enormity of, and it will be a disaster for all of us, not just the people with pensions.
Yeah, I find it interesting. He questions the seriousness of our numbers and he's not willing to put specific cuts on the table. I think if you want to solve this problem with cuts, you identify the education programs that go away, you identify the health care that goes away, and you identify the human services that go away. I think that's your responsibility if you're saying cut. I also think the history of Illinois over the last decade is that it has cut. I think the last 2 years it has cut. This year it cut $1.4 billion. What more are you going to cut? We already ranked 49th out of the 50 states in the portion of education funding K-12 fund from the state level. What are you going to cut? Healthcare? We're not putting anything into that in state dollars. I showed you. It's all coming from the feds. Why would you cut that? Today in Illinois, 30% of our population is either completely uninsured or on Medicaid. Really? You want to cut that? Today in Illinois, 43% of the employees who have a job don't get employer-sponsored health insurance. Really want to cut that? Human services. Last time there was a national comparison, you know where Illinois ranked in funding, caring for folks with mental health problems, DD, all that stuff? At or near the bottom of the nation. And we've cut it by billions in the last decade. Really? You want to leave more vulnerable people without services they need? What are the consequences of that? Right now, today in Illinois, in Marion, there are no more domestic violence prevention centers. Now, the 40 or 50 gentlemen that went to those centers to keep them from being violent cost us about $6,000 a year in taxpayer dollars to keep them from being violent. They didn't magically get less violent when these centers closed. So I'll guarantee you what they will do. They will come home and they will start beating their wives and their spouses and their girlfriends. That's what they'll do. Some of them will beat them so bad they got to go to jail. Now, it's going to cost us $30,000 a year to incarcerate them. The family lost their income. The woman needs assistance, and she's probably not the only victim. You got the kids. What's our fiscal cost there? We are one of the lowest taxing states in the nation. Not one person who has looked at this problem says you do not need a major revenue increase in Illinois to solve it. There's a lot of quibbling about the other stuff. Should we adjust this? Should we? There's really no issue. We need a tax increase. None. And once we've paid back sort of those obligations that are hanging over our head, the recurring hole is nowhere near as large as even Mark made it out. In fact, it includes obligations. This retiree health care thing, it's contractual pay-as-you-go thing. You're not required to set aside an asset for it. There's been a change in federal law in health care, and pretty soon that whole thing's just going to go away as the federal law comes into play. It's a non-issue. Real issue on the table is we have been lied to by politicians for over 30 years. We have been told as a state we can have public services, we just don't have to pay for them. That's ridiculous. There is no way you can have a just civil society. There is no way you can be competitive in a global economy if you underinvest in education, infrastructure, healthcare, human services. You just can't do it. So why don't we stop buying the malarkey? Why don't we stop supporting politicians who want a job so badly they're unwilling to do it? With a thoughtful revenue enhancement, increase in the income tax from 3 to 5 points, expansion of the sales tax base to include consumer services, targeted tax relief to low and middle income families, we can solve a significant portion of this problem. As far as the pension debt, we got to pay it. Can't legislate it away. Got to pay it. So let's put in a payment schedule for that makes sense, that we can afford, and that doesn't backload costs onto future generations. Thank you.
Guys have been going at it for a while. That's good. So I'm going to take that journalist's cop out of firing in all directions. I don't think I'm going to be able to identify errors of fact in what either Ralph or Eden have to say, but I do hear some contortions of language. I have a bookmark that hangs over my desk at my office in the home, and it's from a quote from Mark Twain. And he said, all op-ed writers should, I think, also have it over their desk. He said, get your facts first, and then you can twist them as you please. So there's some twisting now and again. And Eden talks about, he said, the private sector has to fund pensions. It seems like lately the private sector files for Chapter 11 and turns their pension problems over to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund, which is a burden on other businesses, it would seem to me. So believe me, my last 8 years at the newspaper I spent on the editorial board. So you're looking at a guy who sat across the table from Steve Chapman every morning for 8 years, and it's a nice table, walnut table, walnut room, but it was still sitting across from Steve Chapman learning about that governs best, governs least, and all those perfect markets, free men and free markets. So I get that. The other thing I think Eden he talks about reform first. My experience with Springfield, I don't get down there regularly, but I covered a few things in Spring Patch, as the Chicago reporters like to call it, illustration of the Springfield reporters. Things tend to move in the omnibus. If this is going to get worked out at all, it's going to be worked out as a deal, and it would include both reform and a tax increase. It's just the way things work down there. And I think it's unrealistic, although hopefully sincere when you say there needs to be reform first. I just don't think that's the way things happen in Springfield. Ralph, I can pick a couple of bones with him where we go back a while. He often speaks to my urban issues seminar at Medill, and he really turns the kids on with what he has to say. But when you hold up a chart of the Medicaid reimbursement strategy that we come up with, where we tax the hospitals, take the money, and get the federal government to match it, it's not necessarily good fiscal policy. And maybe you probably agree that it's not the greatest thing in the world, but just as a political strategy, Ralph, saying we're going to get something from Washington is going to no longer work. I mean, that's what the Tea Party thing is all about. I mean, that's a rhetorical dynamite. It's like putting a bullseye on your you-know-what and saying hit me. And I was going to hit you, Ralph, for using expressions like structural reform and revenue enhancements, where it's really, you're talking about a tax increase. But darned if in your 4-minute rebut here, you didn't say tax increase. So I'll take a pass on that one, Ralph. But let's get our facts first and go on. Twist them as we please.
I don't think I'll need nearly 5 minutes. I've heard that it's a shared problem, and I think everyone in this room knows the magnitude of the problem. What I've seen is that the employees, current employees, future employees, and even potentially retirees are asked to fix the problem. It is a shared problem. We all have a stake in it. Most of the people that I've talked with, those are current employees and you understand the magnitude of the problem and are willing to work towards solving the problem. And many people that I've talked to understand, hey, no pension in Illinois is taxed, and we are willing to help fix the problem and say, yeah, well, we need to be taxing a portion of our pensions. The concern is that you cannot or should not tax the people that least can afford it. So again, it's a shared problem. We all need to be involved in it. We've all elected our legislators who have created the problem. They are, in essence, kind of our employers. And the people, they're involved. So it is a shared problem. That's really, that's the extent of what I have to say, but I think that we can work together. I don't think, I've attended most of two pension modification task forces, one in 2005 and one in 2009, and there have been significant changes made. It is also the case that the changes in 2009, just made and put into public act. It's also the case there's no financial gain for 20 or 30 years. People gotta retire before you see the money, okay? And, there's talk that maybe there's gonna have to be some tweaking of potential pensions of current employees. But there are ways to deal with that, Maybe current employees would say, look, we understand, so, okay, we'll contribute another %. I don't know, but we have a massive problem. And I won't, since I'm retired, I won't speak for current employees, but it's a huge problem, and we share it, and it's just not us. Thank you.
Thank you to all for having us. It's been a very enlightening session. We now have the Q&A, and I've got about 30 or 40 questions so far. So I'm going to use my authority and judgment to select those which haven't already been covered by the panelists. The first question is addressed to anybody who would like to answer it. All pensions in Illinois are tax exempt, both public and private. Would not a modest tax on these pensions help address the fiscal crisis? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, it would help, and it probably should be added in the base. Of the 41 states that have an income tax, only 3 exempt all pension income. And so at some point, with the graying of America and the significant portion of wealth and assets and income in the elderly generation, that's going to have to be subject to the income tax base at some point.
All right.
I agree.
Well, here's one which is, I won't say something. Okay. Why does the state make the payments so we can get at Social Security and then the state get out of the pension business?
Well, the state tried doing that. It's called Nebraska. And in the 60s, they switched from a defined benefit system to a defined contribution system in Social Security. And about 5-6 years ago, they switched back. And when they testified to Congress as to why, they made it very clear there were 2 reasons. Number one, it was higher cost overall for them to do a defined contribution style system with Social Security than it was for taxpayers to fund a defined benefit system. And not only was it higher cost for taxpayers, it was significantly lower benefit to workers. So it's your classic lose-lose scenario, and the traditionally Republican and relatively conservative state of Nebraska switched back.
This question is addressed to Mr. Martin. How would the unfunded liability be reduced by the state going to a defined contribution plan, including Social Security, for the 70% of state employees not now covered by Social Security?
Okay, to answer that, I have to explain a little more what we are proposing, or what we're not proposing. We are not proposing to affect the pensions of anybody who is retired. I don't think you can do that under the contracts or the Constitution. Nobody's proposing that, although there have been reduction, but it's still a huge liability, and I don't know which of my fellow speakers said that's still a huge problem, and they're right, and we're gonna have to deal with that. But there would be a major cost reduction in terms of the estimated value of the unfunded liability for the pensions, and there would also be, since it isn't as well as a liability, a major savings in 40 million roughly of estimated retiree health care if there were some form of cost sharing, let's say, typical of what you would find in the private sector. There would be additional savings going forward as you feather in reforms, but just in terms of the estimated existing liability, you're talking about maybe 25 billion and half of the 40 billion or so, depending on the.
Thank you.
So, if you freeze the pensions of everyone at this point, the 62-year-old or 65-year-old who is getting a pension of $40,000, let's say, and lives in Chicago, that's higher than the CSRS average, they're not going to get a cost of living increase.
Yes, yes. Here's.
There's good. This is important stuff.
It's absolutely important because nobody who's proposing reform wants to violate the contracts. And people who have retired wouldn't have anything change because they earned their pensions under a deal that was in effect all the way through their career, including the COLA rights, and you can't change it any more than you can in the private sector. Contract's a contract. And if you're 53 and you're planning to retire at 55 and you have in your deal a 3% COLA without a reduction, you keep all of those elements. So we are proposing changes, but they're entirely prospective. They would not affect what people have earned in their up to their retirement, or including the COLAs, or the accruals that they have earned up to the point of change.
But if these, here's a question from me. If these changes are prospective, how does that get us out of our present problem?
Well, it doesn't get us out of our present problem, but because the current pension liabilities are estimated by the actuaries using future retirement wage levels. Okay, let's say on average people work 30 years. Let's say on average the workforce has 15 years more to go. Ballpark. Okay, those estimates include in them an estimated increase in salaries for the next 15 years. Okay, and that would not be in the estimate. It's not in the legal liability, but it would not be in the estimate, and it shouldn't be in the estimate. But for what people have earned, either whether they're retired or accrued up to whenever the change happened, let's say it happened January 1, 2012, then everything that people have accrued up to that point, they are protected by contract, and they have to be. Otherwise, I think it would be unconstitutional. With the private sector, and this is, I guess, the way I would think, has had to deal with these prospective, and it hasn't been ruled that they were in breach of their contracts if they do it just prospectively without taking away anything that people have earned. And that's what we're suggesting. And it's painful. I mean, people signed on to something thinking that it would last for the next 40 years. The problem is the state can't afford it. The private sector doesn't get it. And I don't think it's politically sustainable. On the other hand, this is a balance. You don't want to take away what people have earned if they're retired or if they're whatever the age is. But think about it this way. Let's suppose you signed on to work at the age of 28, and let's say you're 20, most of you are retired or close to what I suspect. So let's suppose you're 28 or 30, like my kids, and they've signed on to work at the state or the city of Chicago. There is nothing that guarantees them a right to work for the next 30 years. They have no contract that says that. And there's nothing that gives them a right to earn a particular salary. All of those things can be changed prospectively. I mean, they would hate it, I suppose, but that's the way the market economy, which has its protections of the sort built into it, that's the way it works. You don't freeze these things in perpetuity. And what the unions are saying, this is their argument, is this, and you're all members of the union, but this is what is being argued. If somebody starts to work for the state, let's say at the age of 22 or 23 or 24, and there are elements in their pension plan at that point in time, then for the rest of their career, those elements, any of them individually, can't be changed to their disadvantage. And what we believe, and employers believe, is that you can change them prospectively only.
They're not making a contractual claim, though. They're making a constitutional do away with that, and the lawyers who say you can't.
Let me tell you what the
It's
words,
unclear.
let me tell you what the words say. Let me tell you what the words say. Prior to 1970, there were pension plans that required people to be a member of the pension plan, okay? And because it was mandatory, there were some courts that said, hey, the employer can change the term, because there was nothing contractual or voluntary about this. They had to do it, no contract, so they can take it away from you at the age of 54 when you're about to retire, you get nothing. And the people who wrote the Constitution in 1970 were right to fix that. And what they said is, no. We are going to reverse those cases, and membership in a pension plan is a contractual relationship. And the benefits of that contract may not be diminished. That's what it said. It was intended to create contractual rights, just like exist in the private sector.
Actually, this next question is related to that. Doesn't the state constitutional pension guarantee take precedence over the 71 pension law, which places responsibility on the pension systems?
Let me acknowledge that there are differences of view about this. When there's a lot of money involved, the lawyers will disagree. There are 5 major Chicago law firms that have looked at this and have concluded that prospective changes which protect people's rights for past service, including if they're retired, are constitutional. But there are other lawyers who believe that they are not constitutional. And until a court finally concludes who's right and who's wrong, judges have pensions, we won't know how it will come out. But if you want to see the legal opinion that goes through the Constitution, the history, the language, and the case law, and concludes that a prospective-only change of the kind I've described is constitutional, it's on our website, illinoisvote.com.
Just changing gears a little bit. Historically, full funding of the CSRS pension benefit has been about 9% of payroll. This is the lowest employer contribution to the pension benefit among Big Ten universities. Is 9% of payroll too much to ask an employer to pay? Any thoughts about that?
Well, no, once again, I think it's not an appropriate comparison 9 times out of 10, but from a normal cost standpoint, the employer contribution, if you're in the private sector, you have a 401k plan and Social Security, your normal cost is about 9.25% to fund those. That's the typical normal cost. The weighted average normal cost across all 5 of Illinois' pension systems, if they were funded, would be 9.3%, so virtually the same as that private sector. The major difference being that the cost, the administrative cost of carrying a DB defined benefit system is significantly lower to the state taxpayers than a defined contribution system would be, as Nebraska found, and the benefits ultimately paid are better. That said, the weighted average benefit, once again, across all 5 systems in Illinois is about $26,000 a year. 78% of the retirees that are members of these plans don't get Social Security, so that would be their sole benefit. And that's hardly gold-plated. It's, in fact, ranks in the bottom 25%, I think, in the nation as far as a average retirement benefit. In fact, our one pension benefit system, our one defined benefit system, when we had one tier, was provided a lower benefit than the 5th and lowest funded tier in New York did. So a lot of this stuff isn't really apples to apples comparisons, right? And when the private sector really moved away from the defined benefit setting to a defined contribution system, there was a federal law change that encouraged that, ERISA, the Employment Retirement Security Act, which made defined benefit systems much more expensive and created much more liability for the private sector than if they switched to a DC system. And so most of them switched to save those costs. ERISA doesn't apply to all of them.
Okay, we've got about 30 more questions in about 5 minutes. I'm gonna summarize 3 or 4 questions that I saw into a single question. If things go on as they are right now, can you actually put a date on when the pension systems will run out of money? Is it next year? Is it 5 years from now? Is it 10 years from now?
They're funded differently, but the estimates that were made by staff working for the Governor's Commission
the state and the idea of raising taxes. And isn't this a terrible time to do that?
Yeah, you know, actually, no, and if you want to report on that, go to our website and look at Moving Forward. We issued it in February of '09. Here's the reality of that. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's.com, who also happens to have been the principal economic advisor to John McCain, the Republican senator who ran for president a bit ago, he developed the multipliers that shows the relative impacts, and really the very worst thing you could do as a state government during a recession is to cut spending. For every dollar you cut in spending, there's a negative multiplier that ripples through your economy of about $1.36, and the reason for that is pretty simple. What state government spends on is pretty much wages and salaries for workers, teachers, and police officers, and healthcare providers, all those folks. So they're losing their jobs. So they stop spending, and they stop spending in the local economy because they have a high marginal propensity to consume. So a spending cut of at the $9 billion range, for instance, where we are this year in our budget hole, would cost Illinois to lose, in addition to whatever public sector jobs we lost, about 128,000 private sector jobs from this negative multiplier effect. And we just lost 400,000 jobs during the recession. We probably can't afford to lose those jobs too. And this is all really based on how you do your tax increase. It needs to be progressive and focused on more affluent individuals because they have a very low marginal propensity to consume. That is, for every dollar they have, they tend to save it or spend it somewhere else. They don't tend to spend it in the local economy. So when you tax them because they have significantly growing incomes, you don't hurt the economy so much in your state, but certainly when folks lose income, they stop spending. Consumer demand is 2/3 of the economy, so it would be brutal. So net, the best thing Illinois could do right now to maintain its jobs would be a progressive tax increase. If you want more information, I just wrote an article about this for Cranes, Chicago Business, and there's that.
Again, this is a composite of several questions which refer to the COLA. How is the COLA funded? To participants actually participate in the COLA, and is half the cost of living index appropriate considering the present, the present value, future money, and so forth? Any thoughts about COLA and whether it's appropriate to keep it or not?
The right answer in terms of how it's funded is that if we funded it correctly, which we don't, actuaries would estimate what the amounts of pensions would have to be paid to people in the future. They would factor in the COLA, whatever is applicable. They would factor in the COLA, whatever is applicable out into the future years. And then they would present value that back to the current estimate of what the funding requirements would be. So it would be in the funding formula just like the base pensions in the funding formula. As to what reforms should be effective, the argument about reforms will not affect you if you were retired. And they won't affect you with respect to anything that you've earned up to the point of the change. But they would affect future.
Yeah, I agree with all that. The one thing I would say, one of the reasons we oppose this pension reform that passed is because the effect of having a quote-unquote COLA that's only limited to one half of the growth of the consumer price index is it effectively means that in real inflation-adjusted terms, retirees will have less to live on every year. The pension benefit will decline from a purchasing power standpoint, which we thought was ridiculous. I mean, whatever the benefit is, I think some very strong arguments could be made that the COLA ought to be tied to the consumer price index, so that whatever you're getting, if it's worth $40,000 in year one, and inflation is whatever it is, then you account for inflation, you get $42,000 in year two, you're equal with $40,000 in year one, you have the same purchasing power. We thought that was a rational way to go. That's not the way they went. Another reason why, frankly, we opposed this reform was pretty simple. They front-loaded those savings. Remember my slide I showed you that under the pension ramp, they go to $4.2 billion this year. They decided to cut that to $3.5, and made the problem worse. So we said we wouldn't support any quote-unquote reform if they front-loaded the savings. Don't want you to front-load the savings, take them when they really happen, put the money in you're required to put in, and somehow, some way they don't like it.
Well, welcome, Ralph, to the general experience of the American people. You know, just what voters are going through now is diminishment of income, what you say is true, 1% is less, 1.5% is less than 3%, but, when you tell that to, voters who are, well, yeah, but you're basically saying you're unwilling to accept a decrease that the rest of the country is already accepting, is that your choice?
Well, no, John, you're assuming that I do wage policy.
We are at 1 o'clock. I suggest that, I apologize for not being able to read all the questions, but we just ran out of time. However, I hope some of the speakers will stay with us during the refreshment period, and you can ask them directly. And I give you now, before I say my final remark, thank you all for coming again. I want to say thank you to Jackie Berger from APAC for her assistance with the arrangements. And also to Donna Knudsen and Rose Burke from our chapter for handling today's arrangements. I'd just like to also remind you that there will be links to today's webcast on the UIC United website as well as the APAC website if you'd like to watch the archived video, which I'm told by correspondence already has been successful. Thank you again.
Timing, huh?
Couldn't be happier.
A lot more relaxed.
Fewer wrinkles.
He would be an appropriate person to handle or delegate these kinds of things to various committees.
Thanks for your help with this.
Oh, my pleasure. Get something going. it's just the laptop. No, just write down the name of the software. The one time you get a use screen, got to be very simple application that I
time, but she's coming along.